So we will soon begin session 4. Close the door, I guess. Unfortunately, Shlomo Shapiro couldn't be here today, so I'm going to chair this session. And I'll introduce briefly our panelists today. First, there's Dieter Bacher. He's Research Fellow and Project Coordinator at the Ludwig Boltzmann Institute for the Research of the Consequences of War in Graz. Since 2022, he's the coordinator of the project Encampment in the Soviet Zone of Occupation in Austria, Post-War History and Memory, funded by the Austrian Science Fund. He's also a research associate at the University of Graz. His main research topic is Soviet and Czechoslovakian intelligence services and operations in post-war Austria, 1945 to 1955, intelligence services in Austria during the Cold War, forced labor in today's Austria from 1939 to 1945, DPs and refugee camps in post-war Austria, 1945 to 1955. And our second speaker will be Ben Fischer. He's a former CIA chief historian, and the White House Millennium Commission chose his monograph at Cold War's End for inclusion in a time capsule slated for opening in 2100. Wow, I didn't know that. Well, that's the idea of a time capsule, I guess. He's a former visiting fellow of the Nobel Institute, and he serves on the editorial board of the International Journal of Intelligence Counterintelligence. And for our third presentation, and since we only have 15 minutes, the two presenters will have 7.5 minutes each. It's a joint presentation. Dr. Ines Reich is here today, but she'll be available for comments. But the two presenters I will also introduce. But Dr. Reich has the study of history and German language and literature at the Pädagogische Hochschule in Potsdam. She received her PhD in history in 1997 at the Karl Friedrich Goerdeler Institute at the University of Potsdam. From 1997 to 2008, she was exhibition curator and research assistant at Sachsenhausen Memorial and Museum, and since 2008, director of Lysenko Strasse Memorial Potsdam of the Brandenburg Memorials Foundation. Lysenko Strasse is the location for the former KGB prison, so it's a very important monument. Her research focuses on resistance against National Socialism, reception of the resistance narrative in Germany, Soviet special camps in Germany, and the history of secret services in the Cold War. Presenting the paper today, co-presenting is Dr. Enrico Heitzer, research fellow at the chair for modern history at the University of Halle. He's the exhibition curator and research assistant for the Berlin Wall Foundation. Since 2012, he's a research assistant at the Sachsenhausen Memorial Museum of the Brandenburg Memorials Foundation. His research focuses on the history of the period between the end of World War II and the early Cold War, denazification, Soviet occupation zone in Germany, SPZ, especially the history of opposition and resistance in the field of intelligence services. And the second presenter is Sebastian Nagel. He's my colleague at the Stasi Records Archive. He works in my project area, and he works on a project near and dear to my heart. He's basically doing an inventory of all of the Stasi foreign intelligence reports at IPN, including hundreds of reports that the Stasi destroyed in Berlin. So they're all here in the archives. And when he's finished with that, of course, we'll be putting it up on our website, but I'm sure IPN will also want to put up on their website. And yeah, we'll see what maybe further cooperation will develop, but it's a very important project. Especially my experience has been the HVA destroyed their records, and they said, you can't write anything about us anymore. We HVA officers are going to write our own history. So I like to use other Soviet bloc archives to help write their history, right, and make some minor corrections. And I think this is also a very important part of all of this. So we'll start off then with Dieter Bacher, and he'll be presenting today. Well, I'll just let him introduce his own presentation. So please go ahead, 15 minutes. I'm going to be strict. And
okay, thanks for your patience. Now it works perfectly. Thank you very much. Well, thanks for your kind introduction, and also thank you for being here. I'm happy to be here and to give you a short impression of one of my recent works, actually, on a CSC operation in Vienna that was called Operation ouch, because of that, the nice title. Let me start with one certain approach. On the 11th of February 1955, the 430th detachment of the American Counterintelligence Corps, in short CIC, gave an interesting report on a certain aspect of the situation in Austria at the time. It was a report on an operation called Ouch that was running at that time already since about 1.5 years and was especially on the positive intelligence from the Soviet side in Vienna and around Vienna. It was actually an operation that followed another operation, the so-called Project Freedom, and was also dealing with additional information and intelligence from several defectors and also double agents run by the CIC. For example, just to give the two examples, Knit and Bait here, and especially working with surveillance in and around Vienna. The CIC stated in this report that their knowledge, their intelligence on positive intelligence of the early KGB in Austria was pretty good, but they were also aware that there was much work to be done, as especially two aspects of Soviet intelligence in Austria were not yet really covered so far. That was especially Soviet counterintelligence and also the Soviet military intelligence in the city. So CIC stated in general that the knowledge on Soviet intelligence was pretty good, but there was still much work to be done. When you look at Austria at the time, this report and also this whole operation from 1953 to 1956, 1957, took place at a quite interesting time when it comes to Austrian history. As you see on this map, this is a map that displays the situation between 1945 and 1955, the so-called post-war or occupation period in Austria. You see that since 1945, the four occupation powers within them, the Soviet Union and the US, had already in 1955 had some time to settle in, with, of course, also their intelligence structures. And the interesting part for us actually was, it was already mentioned, we did the last 3 years, especially a research on Czechoslovakian intelligence in Austria. And one aspect that came to our mind when we were doing our research on the Czechoslovakian side was that we saw to what extent the Eastern intelligence services, especially the Czechoslovakian, Hungarian, and also the Soviet ones, were cooperating in Austria already, at least from the end of the 1940s on. So it was for us quite interesting to look at this operation from one certain point of view, to see how much this cooperation between Czechoslovakian and Soviet intelligence was mentioned in these materials. And this Project Ouch was also interesting for us because we knew a similar operation that was going on a few years earlier. It was the so-called Operation Project Keen that was focusing on the establishment on the Czechoslovakian residentura in Vienna in the early 1950s. So we expected actually to see in this Project Ouch at least a few references of cooperation between the Soviet and Czechoslovakian side. And well, I have to say, as it is sometimes in research, you can be wrong. We saw that this Operation Ouch, when I went through these materials, it's a 4-volume file in the NARA in Washington, D.C. in College Park. You see in these materials that this project really focused mainly on the Soviet activities. As I mentioned already, late MGB, early KGB, military intelligence, and counterintelligence. This is an early photo we have from MGB Corps in Vienna. It's one of the few photos we have from a private archives that displays a unit of the MGB in Baden, close to Vienna. I will explain afterwards why Baden is important in this case. So the Project Ouch actually started in October, late 1953. That means already during the late MGB time. That means Project Ouch in the first reports dealt with MGB, with the already well-established MGB structures in Vienna and Baden. Baden is a small city close to Vienna, about 20 kilometers from the city. And Baden was a very important center, especially for Soviet counterintelligence. The interesting thing was, but this report these files get really interesting when you look in the files of, you can say, early summer 1954, when CIC was mainly focusing on the rebuilding of Soviet structures in Austria between MGB and KGB phase. These docs show also that to a certain kind, you would say, okay, they just changed the name and nothing else changed, but the documents of the CIC actually pretty clearly show that not only the name was changing, but also the staff and also the structures were rapidly changing in 1954. They were rapidly changing, yes, but with one exception. And this exception, interestingly, was Soviet counterintelligence. As I already mentioned, they were stationed in Baden near to Vienna. And the interesting thing is that you see in these documents that the personnel that was observed, surveilled by CIC in Vienna and Baden, was actually many of the staff that was already there in 1953 stayed also in Baden until in Baden and Vienna until 1955, until the end of the occupation period. There was one interesting example when I looked through the files that was quite familiar to me, and this is this person. These are the photos shown in the files. They're not very well, sorry for the bad copies. But the person you see here, when I saw the name that was associated with these pictures, in fact I gave the CIC the name of this person. This person was very familiar to me. We have only the sure name of this person. This person was called Fedorchuk. And he was the deputy chief of Soviet counterintelligence in Baden near to Vienna and later in Vienna itself. Why was this person interesting for me? Well, I came across this name already, I have to say, 15 years ago in a project we did on Austrians who were, because of suspicion of anti-Soviet espionage, arrested in Austria during 1950 and 1953. We speak of about 100 persons. They were arrested, then they were taken to Baden. In this house you can see here, the so-called Nicoladoni house in Baden, near to Vienna. Today in this complex is the city archives, and there was one of the major compounds of Soviet counterintelligence. And there, the investigation was done. Most of the persons were also convicted there. They were sentenced between 1950 and 1953 to death, were transferred to Moscow, and then executed in the Butyrka prison in Moscow. And on many of the documents we got during this research from Soviet archives, from Russian archives, this name Fedorchuk is mentioned as the person who was mainly responsible for these investigations. And it was interesting to see his name also in the CIC file, because we knew from this point on that also the CIC was quite aware of him. Unfortunately, from the Soviet documents, we don't really have much information on Fedorchuk, and also the CIC did not know much about him. But one thing is really mentioned several times in the CIC investigation, that from the side of the CIC, from the perspective of the CIC, Fedorchuk was one of the oldest major veterans within Soviet counterintelligence in Austria. So quite an interesting person. But as I said, unfortunately, there will be more research has to be done from our part to maybe learn a little bit more about this person. In 1955, in the beginning, you have to say that during the Operation Ouch, the main focus of the CIC was identifying the old stuff that remained within the early KGB and also the new stuff that was transferred to Austria during early summer 1954 for the new structures. In 1955, this changed a little bit as the main focus of the investigation changed to another aspect, you can say, changed to identifying the main, you can say, Austrian assets that were connected with the new Soviet intelligence in Austria, also with counterintelligence. And the hotspots where you see they gained most of the information by surveillance, by direct surveillance. You have also many surveillance protocols within the file. That's quite interesting. And when you look at these surveillance protocols, you see that CIC chose two main hotspots for the surveillance operations. Two hotels that are also today still existing in Vienna, the Hotel Imperial and the Grand Hotel, both hotels at the Kärntner Ring, a very famous and also very expensive region in Vienna. And these two hotels were interesting for the CIC because they knew that most of the Soviet officers, also most of the Soviet intelligence staff, had their, not only their flats, but also their bureaus there. So most of the surveillance were conducted around these two spots. And the interesting thing is, when it comes to the conclusion of this surveillance, when you look at it a little bit more in detail, you see that, as I said, the first thing the CIC concluded was that most of the personnel of positive intelligence, of KGB positive intelligence, was changed during 1954 and 1955. Counterintelligence stayed nearly the same. But the interesting thing was also that they were also aware of a certain role of the Austrian police, state police, in this connection. We already discussed it today short. The first thing is that the CIC also stated, okay, we know that the Austrians and also the Austrian assets are pretty aware of the dangers such a cooperation with Soviet forces delivers. Because, as I already mentioned, about 100 people were sentenced to death because of espionage during 1950 and 1953. So that was a really present danger for, you can say, Austrian assets from both sides. And the second thing that is quite interesting is that also the CIC was, of course, aware that the Soviet side had also their connections, also their contacts within the Austrian police and state police. But this was not a topic as often as I would have thought it is when I started this research. Because you have to say, in 1945, when they put up the new police forces in post-war Austria, you had many people in these new police forces who came from the Communist Party or were associated with the Communist Party, especially in the state police and criminal police. This declined during the occupation period, and in 1954, the percentage of these people still remaining in the force was quite a lower. It was already a very small one. So, and this is also this can also be proven by these materials, as the CIC said, yes, this question of Soviet informants in the police force is still a question to us, but it's not as important as it was, so it's not so much a topic for us anymore. The CIC mainly more focused on contacts of Soviet intelligence within the Austrian Viennese population, you have to say, and they tried via their surveillance to reconstruct the networks and to identify the assets within the Austrian population. To draw some conclusions, as I said, the CIC considered itself at the end of 1955, 1956, to be quite well informed about the new situation of Soviet intelligence in Austria. And they also understood in these last reports of the project that Austria would play even after the end of the occupation period, even after the Soviet occupation forces had left, that Austria would remain an important and interesting place for intelligence. And as we already saw today, for example, by the presentation of Kevin Riele, that this was an estimation that proved to be quite right. And from my point of view, Operation Ouch, as a little bit spy versus spy file, you have to say, is quite interesting for us, I think, to get a little bit a better understanding of Soviet intelligence and counterintelligence and the role of this time as a setup for early KGB operations in Austria. Thank you very much for your attention.
Well, thank you, Dieter, for the outstanding presentation, and within time as well, 15 minutes, very good. Our next speaker is Ben Fisher. He'll also be talking about spy versus spy, but in this case, it's the master of the spy game, Rem Krasilnikov, and the destruction of CIA Moscow Station.
Okay. My presentation is called Master of the Counter Spy Game, General Rem Krasilnikov. Krasilnikov was the chief of the first department, the American department of the second chief director of the KGB. That means he was the top dog in charge of operations against Moscow Station. His job description was pretty straightforward. Keep the CIA from recruiting Soviets, and if they did recruit Soviets, try to catch them red-handed in the act of meeting with their agents. He's not well known in the West. He's a legend in Russia, as you might expect. But when he died, The New York Times, the Washington Post, and The Economist all ran long obituaries of him. I quote the New York Times because I like the title. I was tempted to use it as the title of my presentation, but it really sums up pretty much what I'm going to tell you later on. Before he died, he wrote a memoir called The Ghosts, or sometimes it's translated The Phantoms of Tchaikovsky Street. That refers to the old U.S. Embassy. It's not there anymore. And the arrow points to the CIA station, which I think was on the 8th floor. The CIA, for many years in the late 60s era, was hesitant to accept Soviet volunteers, people who walked in, we call them walk-ins, who wanted to volunteer to spy. We were afraid of what are called dangles. Dangles are phony agents, fake agents. They pretend to spy for you while they're remaining loyal to the other side. But then they woke up one day and decided, if we don't accept walk-ins, we're not going to have any agents because there's no other way to get access to Soviets. And there's a dispatch went to all the stations and bases around the world that said, we've changed our doctrine. From now on, we're going to accept walk-ins. Red Top was a cryptonym that referred to the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe. And they drew two conclusions. One is the East Bloc hasn't been using dangle operations in recent years, which was clearly not true. And secondly, even if they are, it won't hurt if we recruit some of these people, run them for a while, and we'll sort it out down the road. They didn't explain how they were going to sort it out down the road. So as a result of this, suddenly they were able to recruit lots of people. Milton Beard was the last head of the Soviet division. He talks about we had the most dazzling array of Soviet agents in the CIA's history. At the same time, their confidence was bolstered by improvements in tradecraft and in technology. Tradecraft. We developed a method called surveillance detection runs or routes. The bane of the CIA's existence in Moscow was surveillance. The key problem was to detect it and elude it or abort your mission if you did detect it. These surveillance detection run, it might take 2 to 5 hours. You'd start out by car, you would then take public transportation, switching off, and eventually arrive at your point of operation on foot. Another intervention, we developed a thing called deep cover officers. They took young officers right out of spy school who had no affiliation with the CIA. They sent them to Moscow and they put them in low-level admin positions in the embassy. They had no contact with the station. They met somebody from the station in a clandestine manner, the way you would meet a spy. They were accountants, consular officers, and things like that. They were supposed to be completely invisible, completely black all the time. Technology. CIA invested millions of dollars in burst transmitters, short-range burst transmitter called SRAC. It's pronounced SRAC, short-range agent communication, which obviated the need for face-to-face meetings and dead drops and that sort of. They sent short encrypted messages. This was the first text messaging system developed in the country. So the next time you send someone a text, you can thank the CIA. You can also thank them for your phones. The technology that makes an iPhone work is called a charge coupled display. It was developed for spy satellites and then later adopted to cell phones. Let's see, was there, another form of technology, I guess it's technology, it's also tradecraft, is CIA developed various forms of disguises. They could make disguise, they could change your appearance, your race, your gender, whatever you need to do. But they also developed one called identity transfer. They could make me look like you, make you look like me. So if you had to go out on an operation, you would pick somebody who normally wouldn't draw surveillance. One of the chiefs of the station went out dressed as his secretary. He had a wig, a dress, and to keep the illusion going, he had the secretary's husband drive him out of the embassy. All right, so CIA looks back this period, 75 to 85, as kind of a golden age of Moscow operations. The drop-off point is 1985. Why 1985? What happened in 1985? My old office mate, Audrey James, happened in 1985. And within months, wiped out virtually the entire cadre of Soviet agents. I'm, with some trepidation, I'm going to press the button. So, Mr. Krasilnikov wrote in his memoir, he took great umbrage at CIA's claim that it was an era of golden operations. He said they only achieved dismal results. He arrested and expelled seven CIA officers who were caught red-handed in acts of espionage. And I have confirmed all of this because there are press reports that bear it out, both in the Soviet press and in the American press. He had extensive knowledge of what was going on in the station. You could see they knew who was who worked with who. They knew practically everything. In the book, there is an appendage with 48 names of CIA personnel from roughly 79 to 91. When I speak like this, I have to submit my presentations to censorship. The censors told me I cannot tell you that all 48 names were valid. I cannot tell you that all 48 names were valid. What I can tell you is if you take the names in his list and run them through the internet, about 70 to 75% of them will show up as retired CIA officers. You can figure out the other 30% for yourself. He was arresting so many so many CIA people that they changed the rubric. They used to say TASS is authorized to announce would be the wrap-up of an operation. They changed it to Committee for State Security, USSR. I think this is because the Krasilnikov wanted credit. I mean, he was racking up brownie points with all of these arrests. He claims that, in essence, he wiped out the whole CIA operation in Moscow. And I talked about the technology and the tradecraft. It was all lost because the agents were all controlled by Krasilnikov. And he uses the word destruction. He said, I presided over the destruction of the station. How did he do it? He did it two ways. First of all, he used what he called deft defense. It's a military term. It means focusing your resources on a particular object or a particular place. Obviously, this is the embassy and the Moscow station. CIA people were followed 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. Their apartments were bugged. Most of the apartments had video surveillance as well. I quoted this KGB officer, what kind of an idiot would approach the American embassy? It kept Soviets from going to the embassy. It kept the Americans from going out and meeting the Soviets. At one point, the CIA got the idea of rolling windows down on their cars so people could put notes in offering to spy. These are called write-ins, obviously. It's parallel to the walk-ins. But the KGB caught on, so they put decoy cars all around Moscow with American diplomatic plates on them and caught spies that way. The problem with the deft defense is passive and defensive. It's not offensive. So how do you attack? Take the battle to the enemy. Well, he used another method called active measures of counterattack. Krasilnikov never uses the word double agent or phony agent or any of the term dangle. The Russian word is postava. He never uses it in the book. He's very coy. He said, well, we had a whole bunch of things that we could do, but I'm not going to tell you exactly what they are. Okay? You have to sort of figure it out yourself. There's the definition of a dangle. We talked about that earlier. And you can see right here at the bottom, I mean, the Achilles heel of the station was they were 100% dependent upon the walk-ins, people who would come in and volunteer to work for the CIA. And he exploited this to the maximum. Is there anything else that I want to say there? I think not. Wrong way. How did he do it? Who knew? Did people of the CIA know that their agents, or a lot of their agents, were controlled by the other side? Joseph Weisberg created the Americans. Many of you have probably seen the TV show. Before he became a showrunner, he worked in the Soviet division at the CIA. So in his spare time, he began reading files. He read about 100 files. He came away with two conclusions. Most of the agents weren't worth what they're being paid. They were low-level people who really didn't know anything. Number two, about a third of them were under KGB control. So he went to a senior KGB counterintelligence officer he knew, and he asked her, is it possible that a third of our agents are controlled by the KGB? She said, no, more. She had a one-word, how am I doing on time, Doug? You're my timekeeper. I'm lousy with time.
5 more minutes, but we'll see.
Okay, I think let's I think I'm going to skip the 2 case studies. I'll make one comment. There's a very famous case. You've all read this book about Adolf Tolkachev, the billion-dollar spy. In my opinion, he was a double agent. He was handled by 6 CIA officers. Krasilnikov mentions all of them in his book. You can see that the upper right-hand corner, those are correspondence that CIA exchanged with him. There's a dead drop site. There's how to use a sub-miniature camera. You can find all of these images in a book written by a CIA officer. They're 100% authentic. In every message to him, he was told, destroy all your spy gear, your correspondence. He obviously kept it. The Russian text says from Tolkachev's spy stash. In other words, he saved it all. There's a picture of Mr. Tolkachev with his colleagues. Those are all KGB officers. He doesn't look scared. He doesn't look like he's under arrest. He doesn't look like a guy who's going to be executed pretty soon. Finally, Krasilnikov has a little fun with his audience. He said, you have all these different explanations about how this man was caught and then executed for espionage. He said, I'm not going to tell you how we caught him. I'm just going to say one thing. You can't find a black cat in a dark room if the black cat was never there. Oh, I'm sorry. My apologies. Now let's just go to the conclusion because we're running out of time. Okay, the obvious conclusion is the KGB exploited our dependence on walking. That's lesson number 1. This could not come as a surprise because virtually all of our Cuban and all of our East German agents were controlled by the other side. Who trained them, who funded them, who coordinated their operations? The KGB did. No surprise there. Most of what we learned through our human agent operation was no more or no less than what the KGB allowed us to know. All of our hard work and the money that we spent on tradecraft and communications devices was for naught because it was compromised as soon as it was handed over to the double agents. The CIA-KGB rival was obviously adversarial, but it was also symbiotic. It was a win-win for both sides. CIA got credit for recruiting all of these agents and winning the Cold War. The KGB protected the country's most important secrets by controlling our operations. Somebody needs to rewrite a history of the KGB-CIA spy wars in the last decade based on Krasilnikov's memoir. It looks a lot different than what the standard version looks like today. Finally, the present. Krasilnikov is considered the father of the FSB, the Federal Security Service. The FSB uses the same training manuals that the KGB use, minus the ideological dogma. So the result is ideology changes, but tradecraft goes on forever. Okay, thank you very much.
So thank you, Ben, for your very interesting presentation. I'm sure there'll be lots of questions. Our next 2 presenters are Enrico Heitzer and Sebastian Nagel, and they'll be presenting on All Spies on Persecution Practices of the Soviet Secret Services in the years after World War II, using the example of Soviet military counterintelligence in Potsdam and the Soviet Special Work Camp number 7/1 in Wesel and Sachsenhausen. I think they have a shorter title now. Very good. Okay, I'll let you take it.
Thank you very much. In the 1990s and early 2000s, research and civil society initiatives mostly assumed that the accusation of espionage against detainees at the Soviet military counterintelligence remand prison in Potsdam's Leistikostrasse was politically constructed, as it had been in the Soviet Union in the 1930s. But this view was supported by the assumption that the Leistikostrasse prison was a Soviet detention center like any other. However, this view was met with a progressive state of historical research and led to intensive debates on remembrance and in the politics of history in Germany. This prison was not a simple Soviet secret service prison, but the central remand prison for military counterintelligence in East Germany. Its main task was to prevent and to investigate espionage against its own Soviet troops. It is therefore not surprising that the majority of German inmates were suspected of espionage. This reflects the degree to which the Western secret services were established and their interest in the level of equipment and deployment of the Soviet army in East Germany. The biographical research of recent years has generally confirmed that the espionage for Western secret services, as will be shown in the following two examples. Walter Mellentin's life can be traced for the first time more than 70 years after his death, because an inscription of his name in the former remand prison points to him and enables initial research in German and US archives. The US Foreign Intelligence Service, CIA, recruited the former German Air Force officer in the late summer of 1950, when the Cold War also reflected in a growing conflict between Western and Eastern intelligence services and resulted in the mass recruitment of spies in the Eastern sphere of influence. By this time, Mellentin can already look back on a long military service in the Air Force of Nazi Germany, including intelligence experience within the Luftwaffe from Spanish Civil War to the end of the World War II. His work for the CIA ended in 1952 when Soviet counterintelligence arrested him in Dresden. After several stints in prison, he was extradited to the People's Republic of Poland. Walter Mellentin had previously been involved in CIA projects Coterie, Redbird, and Bedlam. It's mainly to recruit Soviet defectors and worked for the CIA he worked for the CIA as a driver and courier between West Berlin and the Polish border. During this work as a courier and driver, he met Franciszek Michalski, who was also working for the Americans, and whom he secretly transported to the German-Polish border. Research here in Poland in the IBN made it possible to the first time to trace the intersecting lives of Mellentin and Michalski. It became clear that the Polish Secret Service was informed of Mellentin's Secret Service activities by a double agent as early as December 1951, without knowing his name. Franciszek Michalski's life, like Mellentin's, is intertwined with the military intelligence of the Nazi state. From 1939 onwards, he was also a Polish citizen, active in intelligence operation against Poland, France, and the Soviet Union on behalf of the German Abwehr. After the Second World War, Michalski was recruited by the CIA too to spy against the Soviet Union and against the People's Republic of Poland. He began to build up a spy network in Poland. Walter Mellentin and Franciszek Michalski were sentenced to death for espionage and executed in Mokotów prison in Warsaw, here in Warsaw. Their names can be found on a memorial at the entrance of today's Museum of Cursed Soldiers and Political Prisoners of the Polish People's Republic. And I would like to summarize many of the Germans imprisoned in the Potsdam remand prison for Soviet military counterintelligence were involved in the intelligence business between East and West. And against this background, the history of the prison cannot be placed seamlessly alongside the history of Stalinist persecution in the Soviet Union in the 1930s. However, the brutal investigation methods, inhuman prison conditions, and long-term sentences must not be overlooked. But the ambivalent fates, such as those of Walter Mellentin and Franciszek Michalski, must be researched, and the victims' remembrance and historical knowledge must not to be pitted against each other. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I'm trying to continue, and I will add some remarks about the special camp, the Soviet special camp in Sachsenhausen. And I have to introduce very short to the topic, because I'm sure not everybody here knows about the Soviet special camps in Germany, because between 1945 and 1950, were 10 so-called Soviet special camps in Eastern Germany, which on the one hand were the result of the discussions between the allies of the anti-Hitler coalition on the radical denazification of the Germans, but on the other hand bore the hallmarks of typical Stalinist camps. And in early August 1945, the special camp number 7 was established by the Soviet Secret Service NKVD in the core area of the former concentration camp. But a similar practice was very common at this time also by other allies of the anti-Hitler coalition. In their case, this practice was set down formally in the Allied decrees with the signatories of the Potsdam Agreement of August 45 committing to it. And so on and so on. I don't want to tell too much about that. In the Soviet occupation zone, about 143,000 Germans were interned under mostly very harsh conditions. In the American zone, more than 100,000. Most of them in Eastern Germany were imprisoned in connection with the Nazi regime, but also partly for political reasons. According to the German historian Lutz Niethammer, the Soviet special camps can be understood as, or he coined the term of Chekist denazification. In matters of espionage, the Soviet special camps have hardly been the focus of attention to date, but because they have rather been discussed in the field of tension between denazification and Stalinist repression. Where is the field of espionage here, or the point? If you look at the Soviet sources, it is remarkable that of the 60,000 or so prisoners in the Sachsenhausen special camp after the war, 5 years after the war, they were not all were at the same time. It is the number of the prisoners through all the years. 2,900 people were imprisoned of charges in connection with intelligence or spy agencies. This is less than 5% of the prisoners, but it's an enormous account. And if you know that Sachsenhausen, the Soviet special camp, was the largest prison camp in Eastern Germany, even in the early existence of the GDR, it was simply the largest prison with 15,000 or 16,000 prisoners at one time. What is about as many, this 2,900 people, this is about as many as were Germans in the special camp Sachsenhausen because of the mistreatment of Soviet or Polish prisoners of war or Ostarbeiters or something like that, just to have in relation what. And I have tried to approach the subjects of penalizing alleged and actual espionage and working for intelligence services in the special camp, and can present some first findings here. So we are talking about 2,900 people. About half of them refer to the Nazi era, the other half to the beginning of the Cold War. Approximately 1,500 were mainly imprisoned in 1945 and 46 in connection with Nazi espionage agencies. Although the range seems to be fairly wide, it starts with a few dozen Abwehrbeauftragten. I don't know how to translate this. They were responsible for counter-espionage in factories and enterprises on the one hand, and for spying and of forced laborers and preventing sabotage on the other hand. And therefore they cooperated with the Gestapo. 2,000 people from the Forschungsamt, the research office, some radio operators, personnel from archival departments, administrative staff. There were also people from file indexes and so on of the Sicherheitsdienst of the SS or the Gestapo, as well as many alleged agents who obviously had no great intelligence value for the Soviet secret services. To name a few examples, very short. The American Franklin Heger, born in Chicago in 1912. I mentioned this because normally everybody thinks special camps were places of imprisonment for exclusively Germans. And it was, in the overwhelming cases, it was the case, but there are some exceptions, especially in this espionage field. American Franklin Heger, born in Chicago in 1912, who is said to have been active in radio reconnaissance, and he was released in 1950. The Volksdeutsche, ethnic German Viktor Löwen, from what is now Ukraine, was a Gestapo radio operator with a low SS rank in Norway. He was extradited, it's also very interesting, to the Soviet Union by the British intelligence service in January 1946, sentenced to death by a Soviet military tribunal and executed maybe in Berlin, we don't know exactly, on September 11, 1946, for Nazi crimes and treason against the motherland. The British had questioned him, but had no intelligence interest in him. Another case was Helmut Brestrich, who has worked as a criminal secretary for the Gestapo since 1935. He worked in Department 3, Espionage and Foreign Legion. In November 1938, he joined the Reichssicherheitshauptamt in the rank, with the rank of an SS Obersturmführer, where he is documented in the Referat Abwehr West. In 1943, he belonged to a special unit which was transferred to the castle in Oberliebig, Horní Libčava, in today's Czech Republic, as far as I know, until the end of the war in 1945. This unit from the Reichssicherheitshauptamt was formed in Paris and later transferred to Berlin, carried out counter-espionage operations on the basis of captured files from the French secret services, Deuxième Bureau and Sûreté Nationale, which fell into the hand of the Soviet Smersh at the end of the war. And as far as I know, these documents have been lost to this day. Brestrich was obviously of interest, but he died already on February 46 on the inhumane conditions in the special camp. These cases were obviously part of denazification or a wider range dismantling, destroying the German special services after World War II. But to have a shift later, convicts from other prisons, such as the prison in the Leistikow-Straße, were transferred to the special camp. For example, people from a larger espionage network called the Liegnitz Group, which had been convicted by Soviet military tribunals in autumn 1948. So we are talking already about the time of the early Cold War, for proven military espionage for the Gehlen organization. More than 20 people passed through the special camp in Sachsenhausen on their way to the Soviet Union, and the camps where one died in Sachsenhausen in 1949. The same applies to the so-called Slavic group around a certain Heinz Keding, who was arrested as a Gehlen man in East Berlin at the beginning of 1948. We still know little about them. I have only been able to see a few documents from the archives of the Bundesnachrichtendienst. But since their agent leader, a former Abwehr officer, Georg Schacht, who had been with the Brandenburgers for a time, also cooperated with the fighting group against inhumanity, about which I wrote my dissertation a lot of years ago, almost exclusively conducted military intelligence, where I assume that this was also a military espionage group. The BND archive has not yet processed my inquiry. While arrests made against alleged and actual Western spies are extensively researched via Stasi and BND archives for the years after 1950, we don't know what is with the approximately 320 alleged agents for the American Secret Services, the 260 alleged agents for the British Secret Service, and the almost 200 alleged agents for foreign and not specified foreign secret services. What is all about them? which you can find in the registry of the Soviet Special Camp, in the Soviet files. This needs to be investigated further. While the Gehlen people appeared in the special camp from autumn 48, some of the agents assigned by the British, American, or not specified foreign secret services had already been sentenced from spring 47. They appeared in the special camp in autumn 47, which, 1 minute, okay, I have, yeah. I make it, I've only a few lines left. They appeared, which this time, this date, in my opinion, clearly indicates the increasing tensions in the early Cold War, and also the shift in the focus of the Soviet Secret Service and counterintelligence away from the prosecution of Nazi crimes, dismantling Nazi structures, towards the persecution of potential opposition and possible spies. So Germany seems to be, for me, a little bit exception somehow, in contradiction to other regions. We heard from Mark Kramer's presentation today. Newer research shows that in Germany, Soviet services had less resources to hunt phantoms because there were real spies around. And there are still large gaps in the research that have to do with source problems, not only in Russia, among other things. And I hope to get some clues from you. Otherwise, my contribution should be an indication of an important desideratum to turn to one of the dark underpinnings of the espionage war in the early Cold War in Europe, the imprisonment of the people who were caught. The files in the archive of Sachsenhausen Memorial, which came in the 90s from Soviet archives, need to be researched further. And yeah, I want to invite you to help me to join this, to look into these files. Maybe we can find out more about this topic. Thank you.
So I would like to thank our presenters for the wonderful presentations. I'd ask you all to come forward now for questions.
No, you go first.
Oh, I guess I get to sit in the middle. I guess I'm like Oprah here. So we'll start with your questions. Kevin.
I don't know if I need a mic or not, but I guess for the cameras, we probably do. Question for Dr. Fischer. Is it possible that Krassilnikov's memoir is a self-aggrandizing and heroizing book about himself and about Soviet intelligence, like so many other memoirs of retired Soviet intelligence officers, and that maybe, and also the research of the FSB and the SVR that's been published in the past 20 years, that maybe it's not as accurate. He published an article in 1989 or co-wrote an article in 1989 in the KGB's internal journal, the Zbornik KGB, KGB Digest, in which he described DIA, Defense Intelligence Agency, operations in Moscow, in Soviet Union in general. And that article showed some pretty significant lack of understanding of how DIA operated. And it was for a KGB audience, not for an external audience. And then if all the CIA recruitments were doubles, why were so many executed?
Okay, I think we'll try to collect a couple more questions, unless, okay.
Yes. Well, first of all, thank you to all the presenters for a very nice panel. That's not easy at this point of the day. I have a question for Enrico Heitzer and for you, Dieter. Enrico, you were kind of caught. You were kind of cut short here in the end. Maybe you could elaborate. It sounded like the start of something new and grand. Maybe you can elaborate a little bit more about this project. And for Dieter, is mainly it seems like it's mainly based on American materials, what you've been talking about. But it would be kind of, I would know you pretty bad if you haven't looked into the Czech materials as well. Maybe you could just say reveal a little bit about this aspect.
Okay, I'll take one more question and then we'll get some answers. So.
May I? Sorry, I have a question to Ben, because you talked about this arrest by KGB of CIA agents after Ames passed the names. When did you have another, let's call it, wave of Soviet officers walk-ins at the fall or at the end of the Soviet Union, or can we compare the? I know that you will not give us details how many persons went to CIA and said, well, we have a lot of information. 1991, did we have such a wave of Soviet KGB officers, military intelligence officers?
Okay, we'll start with Ben and Oran.
Okay, yeah, fine. I hope I remember the questions. All memoirs are self-aggrandizing. That's why people write them. Krasilnikov is no exception in this regard. Every case that I have studied, I can show that that our people were arrested and expelled. There's no controversy about this. They were all, as I said, arrested and expelled. You mentioned, my memory's not working here. You mentioned DI. Oh, the executions. The execution, they didn't take place. You have to bear with me on this.
That was the disinformation, not his.
Yeah. No, a lot. I would say that every major asset that we had in the Soviet Union was a double agent. There's some minor ones who were arrested, but all of the major, they faked the executions. You can't prove that these people were executed. In some cases, they were allegedly executed years after they were arrested. My favorite one, which I didn't have time to go into, was the Trigon case, where allegedly the agent was arrested. He asked for his fountain pen. They went and got it. He opened it, and he swallowed a capsule of cyanide. In my presentation, which I didn't have time to show, I can show you this man was a career KGB officer. He began as a snitch in the university. After he graduated, he asked the KGB to send him to graduate school on the assumption he could spy on a higher class of people. He did die in 1977. I have a picture in my presentation. He's being buried by a KGB honor guard. His mother's there dressed in black. A guy's holding a rifle. And then I have another picture of his contemporary grave. He's buried alongside his mother. It's an Orthodox cross. And ready for this? He's buried in the same cemetery as Krasilnikov. It's a very prestigious resting place. So that kind of gives you a flavor of what I'm talking about. Yeah, there were some genuine agents. I mean, we know there were some people who were arrested and were sent to the Gulag and later got. But the ones that I'm looking at, the big ones, were all controlled by the other side of this. I'm absolutely convinced. Another cut at this was the case officer for this fellow Algorand was a woman named Marty Peterson. She's an old friend of mine. I've known her for 40 years. She wrote a memoir in 2012 about the case. If you go back and look, and there's a man named Semyonov. He was a very famous pulp fiction writer. He was a good friend of Yuri Andropov. Andropov gave him the case files and let him write a book. The book was called Task is Authorized to Announce. If you read Task is Authorized to Announce, which was published in 1979, and you read Marty's memoir in 2012, it's like reading the same book. In other words, they knew all of the things that were supposedly known only to the CIA. Did I answer? Was there another question?
Yeah, the other question was about, was there another wave of sort of...
Oh, let me explain. The people that I'm talking about are not related to Ames. The Ames, some of the agents' names that Ames gave the KGB were double agents. And it goes to my point about the CIA knew they were doubles. Ames made his first approach in April of 1985. He gave them the names of KGB officers that the CIA was convinced were double agents. And that's why he did it it helped him with his conscience. He thought, I'm not only screwing the CIA, I'm screwing the KGB. And he was right. They paid him $50,000 for the names of their own double agents in order to protect the double agents. It was only later in June when he realized what he had done, and he realized now the big threat to him was somebody inside the KGB might be able to identify him. So he had to eliminate all of them, which is what he did. The entire stable of assets. And by the way, on your comment about Krasilnikov, he takes great umbrage about Ames. He said Ames was useful, but the CIA says he's this great Leviathan that helped us arrest all these people. He said, no, we did our homework. We were pretty good at what we were doing. We're grateful for what he did, but we're running our own show.
Thank you for the question, Thomas. I think we are cooperating already too long. You know me pretty well. That's true, of course. That's always step 2 for me after step 1, examining the files of, in this case, CIC. But I have to admit, in this case, this approach is it seems to me currently pretty difficult. There are, I think, 2 connections mentioned with with people from Czechoslovakia. So I tried to check them on the Czechoslovakian side, but it seems that these 2 people had no connection at all to Czechoslovakian services. They were really, you have to say, these were obviously people from Czechoslovakia that lived in Vienna and were run here by Soviet intelligence and not by Czechoslovakian intelligence. I was not able to find any information on them on the Czechoslovakian side. Then, as we already mentioned, it's pretty difficult with Soviet sources on that case. So the Soviet side is pretty difficult. Would be interesting, of course, but it's very difficult. And of course, it would be also an interesting question to say, okay, how much did actually the Austrian state police knew about all these activities in Vienna and what was going on here, especially as we have a few Austrian information in the American files. But the interesting thing is, as we had it already in other American documentations, that the Austrian information in the CIC file was not shared by corporation. It was from American CIC informants within the state police. So I was also not able yet to find any Austrian information on these cases. So in this case, I have to admit, I'm relied on the American files because there are currently really no connections to other file stocks as far as I know.
Thank you for this question. I wish I could start talking about such a project, but to make such a project, it's more an idea, because to make such a project you need money. I think it could be a good dissertation, PhD project. You need to consider the special camp in Sachsenhausen was the biggest prison at this time on German soil, and a focal point and many alleged or actual spies in this early time where the sources are very scarce and there are a lot of loopholes even in Western archives, or you don't have access. They find together there, and you have if you start to explore this topic and accept this perspective and looking into the Soviet files, you find very interesting people and cases which in each individual case should be explored further. I just want to mention 2 additional cases, because normally, as I mentioned, the Soviet special camps in Germany are debated as places of German suffering, of German victims, but there were also, in a limited extent foreigners. I mentioned this American who worked for the Abwehr as far, but I also, for my Polish colleagues, want to mention Lech Zita, who was born in Warsaw, and he was convicted 1946 by a Soviet military tribunal. He was arrested in Berlin in 1946 as an alleged member of the Secret Service of the Armee Anders. I don't know what if this is true. I don't know, but somebody should research all these cases. Or there's one staff member of the fascist Italian embassy who the Soviet counterintelligence believed to belong to the intelligence staff of the Italian fascist regime. Who he couldn't run away in 45 Berlin, and so he was incarcerated. And in his case, I have contact to the family, and they, of course, believe he was just the driver. So this is already known from the German cases. The people were only the driver. But I don't have access to Italian archives to find out what is with Giovanni Bellotti. If he was he really an intelligence guy from fascist Italy or the driver? So I all invite you to take a closer look into this field or find something who writes a dissertation or something. Thank you.
Sebastian, would you like to say something? Okay. I was just wondering if you'd all tried to look at U.S. records. I mean, it's okay, good. Very good. Okay, next question. In the back, there was a question. Yeah.
I have a question about the agents. Thank you. About the CIA working with the Soviet or initiatives. How does it reflect on the current effort of the CIA to run intelligence collection, inviting Russians to connect with them on the web via the Tor? And how would they deal with it? Because all the information, it's anonymous, you don't know them, and probably most of it is, again, double agents. Thank you.
The answer was in the very last thing I said, that Mr. Krasilnikov is considered the father of the FSB. Ideology's changed, but tradecraft stays the same. I read about the CIA effort to use the internet to attract people. My guess is that the double agents are lining up and ready to go. I don't think that they can do any better job today than they did in the past of vetting the agents. They never had an ability to really vet agents, to really do. Now, that may be different today. I remember in the Cold War, you couldn't even look up a person in a phone book in Moscow, let alone find out where he worked and so forth and so on. Maybe that's better today. I don't know. We have more access to information. But my guess is that the Soviets will, the Russians, I'm sorry, the Russians will try to feed people in. They'll sluice people into this group of people showing up to spy.
And of course, there'll be the double agent bots.
Thank you. I have a question for Dr. Fischer. You've talked at length about the Rem Krasilnikov and this mindset of Russian offensive counterintelligence. I've been wondering if you could share, you kind of answered already, but I wonder if you could share anything about his legacy and his pupils, like Alexander Zomov with GT Prolog and his prominent role in FSB in Moscow just a couple of years back, and how this modus operandi from back in the Soviet time, deep Soviet time, offensive counterintelligence transforms into modern world, and how FSB sees it today, as far as you know.
The man that he is referring to, Alexander Zhomov, is the ultimate double agent story. Zhomov was a senior counterintelligence officer. He approached the chief of station in Moscow, a man named Jack Downing, and offered to sell him information from inside the KGB. What kind of information? It was information that would deflect attention from Aldrich Ames. It provided an explanation for why all of these agents were disappearing based on alleged but actually fabricated FBI counterintelligence records, KGB counterintelligence records. The deception went on for almost, I think, was it 3 years. And then finally, push came to shove. Double agents cannot defect because they're double agents. And he was offered the opportunity. He said he wanted to spy to bank money and move to the United States. Of course, his last contact with the CIA was Downing's successor and his wife were in Leningrad, and they saw Zhomov with a group of KGB people, and they waved goodbye. In other words, he's giving him the finger. I fooled you, and joke's on you. But what's fascinating about this is before the operation ended, Zhomov said, look, I've got the names of about half a dozen double agents that the KGB is going to send your way, and I'll tell you who they are and where they work, but you must promise me that you'll recruit them. You'll run it as if they're real agents. Otherwise, it'll come back on me. What's interesting is that even after the CIA realized that Zhomov had duped them, they kept on running the agents. Now, why did they do that? Because they needed the agents to replace the agents that Ames had betrayed. I mean, it was dishonest. It's corrupt, and they kept running these agents even after they knew that they were part of this bigger ploy.
Any more questions?
Excuse me. Even though I share Paul's skepticism about Krasilnikov's memoir, I still, I mean, as you say, you can find evidence to bear out quite, a good deal of what he says. There was a document I came across, it was sometime in the 1990s in the Stasi archive about Cuba. And this was not, a memoir. This was something that I think it was prepared in the late 80s. I think it was around the time that Gorbachev was going to Cuba in 1987. And they went through what they saw as CIA spies in Cuba and determined that every single one of them was a Cuban double agent. So.
And East Germany, too. Yeah.
I guess I'll ask a quick question. I already know this, but what's your problem with the $1 Billion Spy? I mean, it's such a great story.
It's a wonderful story. It's a wonderful story, and I'm sure that the author made a lot of money. It's a bestseller. People praise it. It's a hoax. I mean, David Hoffman, the author, was given 1,000 pages of CIA documents to write the book. But look at the documents. They're all the logistics of handling the agents. There's not the CIA has never released one page of anything that Tolkachev gave us the CIA. By the way, this is a pattern that runs through the other double agent operations. Ogorodnik, for example, he supposedly gave us sheafs of paper about arms control and China and things like that. The agency has not released not a single page. There's another agent. He's known as the jewel in the crown of the CIA, and he supposedly they had 42 safe drawers of his reporting over roughly an 18-year period. They have not released a single page. A friend of mine actually looked at the Tolkachev stuff. She had to go to a special vault to look at it. And she said it was all technical stuff. It's all technical gobbledygook. Well, okay, what did he tell us? He told us about radars. Well, all radars, whether their radars or our radars, have to conform to the principles of physics. You might put screws in this way on one and screws this way on the other, but they're still, the only thing you really know is, are theirs better than ours? Now, Hoffman would have you believe that the Cold War pivoted on this question of Soviet radars. It didn't have anything to do with the Cold War. It's a much overrated book.
So Władek had a question. So it's the logistics or...
If so, what do you think about the Kuklinski case?
In my spare time, I wrote an article about Colonel Kuklinski. Does everybody in this audience should know who he was? He was a Polish general staff officer who spied for the CIA. Absolutely the best operation of the Cold War. CIA did two things that were very good. They worked with Colonel Kuklinski, who gave us insight not only into Polish affairs, but more importantly into Soviet affairs as well. The other thing was we supported a Polish journal called Kultura, which was critically important and eventually in the liberation of Poland. So anyway, I wrote an article about the good colonel. I did it on my own time because he was of interest to me. I did it at home at night. I did publish it in the in-house journal. And writing about Colonel Kuklinski, I had to also write about General Jaruzelski. And General Jaruzelski took great umbrage at my article. And it just so happens the Polish-American woman who was running the Polish branch of the Foreign Broadcast Information Service was in Warsaw. The bureau is now here. And she picked up a copy of a journal called Żis. And he attacked me. He really was very angry at me. He spent 35 pages calling me all kinds of names. And I thought that was great. I mean, I was quite flattered. I mean, I'm an obscure federal historian that nobody knows, and suddenly this very important world figure is pissed off at me. It was actually quite interesting. Yeah, but I also learned something from that article. I'm not a trained historian. I'm a writer. I'm a wordsmith. But when I went back and read it again, I think some of my views about Jaruzelski might have changed a bit. And I realized that as a historian, I had a duty to kind of put myself in his shoes and try to see the world as he saw it. And while I don't particularly like the man, I think I have a better appreciation for his role in history and the dilemmas that he faced. So it was a learning experience.
Okay, well, I think we will close our panel now. I want to thank all of the panelists, and I don't know if there's somebody who needs to speak about logistical arrangements, or am I...
Thank you very much. And just a few logistical arrangements, I'd said. So all the speakers and chairs are invited to dinner, and I will lead you to dinner from the hotel. So we are meeting 6:30 before the hotel, and I will try to get you to the dinner place. Thank you very much, and I invite you for the next day of our conference.